Hello everyone. In this lecture we will be discussing literature reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, a little bit of the history of meta-analysis, and some of the stages in a systematic review process. So the purpose of a literature review is basically to summarize an empirical body of empirical literature. There are several different ways in which you can accomplish this. Historically, one of the better known approaches to doing this is the narrative review, which is something that is going by the wayside, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis. And we'll talk about the differences between all three types of these reviews. So basically, a narrative review historically has been something that's been written by an expert in the field. It's a little bit more informal. The reviewer will use subjective methods to collect and interpret the information. The reviewers may have some sort of purpose for writing the paper, which could introduce some bias, either explicitly or implicitly. They may take the approach that makes the most sense to them, or makes the most sense for the research question that they're trying to address. But ultimately what it is it's a subjective approach. It's their opinion of the way to proceed. And basically a narrative review will provide a summary of the research literature that is a narrative in nature, basically. So there are some limitations to this approach. One example is that different experts may perform a review on the exact same body of literature, investigating the same questions, and they can come to different conclusions. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. One might be that they actually might select to review different sets of studies or to place more emphasis on some studies than others. Even when same studies are reviewed, the process of integrating them is ultimately subjective, so you could give expert reviewers the same set of studies to review and they could ultimately come up with still different conclusions. Another challenge of the narrative review is that they tend to struggle as the amount of data accumulate. So for example, it's possible for a researcher to combine results from a few studies in his or her head, but as the number of studies increase that one is expected to be reviewing, it can become difficult to sort of keep in mind everything that you've read, everything that you've learned, and to summarize all of your notes effectively. For example, in education and other areas in the social sciences, it's not unusual to see a review that has more than 10 studies, or at least 10 studies. And again, you can imagine how much easier it is to summarize 5 studies versus 10, 20, 30, 40, etc. Another problem with narrative reviews is that they oftentimes struggle addressing why there's variance across studies. So oftentimes if you look in a meta-analysis today at a table that summarizes all the correlations analyzed in the data set, you might see a lot of fluctuation in those correlations. Well, in a traditional narrative review, it can be more difficult to understand when summarizing why there's variance. If you were to have a set of studies with the same result, then summarizing those studies in a narrative review would be quite easy. But this is impossible. You'll never see this happen. Studies do not have the same results across the board. There's always going to be variation. Another challenge is that as the number of studies grow in a literature area, they often investigate their research questions in different populations. So for example, in my field of management, oftentimes you'll see studies that were conducted using student samples, other studies conducted using actual working adults. You can imagine why there might be variation in various results. So for example, if you were to do a study on pay and you're trying to look at how well pay motivates performance, well, it might be different in a classroom setting or a laboratory setting than an actual employment setting. Or in my field, again, management, if you have two different industries, you have, let's say, the banking industry versus manufacturing and production industry, or maybe a service-oriented industry like a restaurant industry, for example, why you might have moderating variables there that might influence a research question, the results of a research question that you're investigating. So in addition to trying to summarize results across different studies, which can vary even in the same context, narrative reviewers may also have the challenge of trying to summarize results across different research contexts. Now, in a literature review, you're typically focused on a statistic of interest. Narrative reviews historically have unfortunately been focused on statistical significance, and this is oftentimes where you see perhaps vote counting coming in, where a narrative review might say, okay, 6 studies found a result that were statistically significant, 4 studies found a result that was not statistically significant. And as we'll discuss throughout this course, meta-analysis is quite effective because it does not have to rely on null hypothesis statistical significance testing, although some people have tried to force its way into meta-analysis research. All right, so systematic review. A systematic review relies upon a systematic and explicit methods to identify and select relevant studies. They can use objective techniques to combine these studies and produce results. So a lot more consistency would result of using a systematic approach. Unfortunately, the term systematic review is not often used in my areas of research, which is IO psychology and areas in meta-analysis. Systematic reviews are a much more common term in fields such as education and medicine. Those who use the term systematic review often, in my fields, restrict the term to meta-analysis. So they're basically, when you say a meta-analytic review in my fields of management and IO psychology, you're oftentimes referring to what others refer to as a systematic review. But a systematic review can be a broader definition. It does not necessarily have to be a quantitative summary of data. It can be a qualitative summary of data, but it has to follow certain rules to be, of course, systematic. So if you hear the term systematic review or meta-analysis, basically in some fields it might be used interchangeably, but ultimately what it is an overall umbrella term. So for example, one of the limitations for this, though, is that meta-analytic researchers in my field will just consider the systematic part the actual analyzing of the data, and they don't do enough of a good enough job providing details as far as how they systematically search the literature. So it's important to keep in mind that a systematic review involves all steps of the research process and not just systematically analyzing the data at the very end. Okay, so a couple of things that you want a systematic review to be. You want it to be very explicit, so state the objectives, the materials, the methods. Oftentimes it's recommended to use a protocol. You can make revisions to your protocol as you go along. This is not uncommon, but you should, update those changes in the protocol. Then ultimately what you have at the end is a protocol that you could share with other researchers if they wanted to replicate your results. So of course you also want your systematic review to be systematic. So for example, in your search of the literature, you want to use key terms, keywords to search for your studies, which is something we'll talk about. Describe the databases that you're looking in. You also want your systematic review to be transparent, so oftentimes you have to state criteria and make decisions about whether or not studies meet those criteria. And this should be something that you should report, decide upon, report, put in your protocol, put in your method section, again, so other people can ultimately reproduce your results, which is another goal. And then finally, you want to take the bias out of the research process as much as possible by, again, being systematic. All right, so ultimately a systematic review is structured and explicit regarding how you're planning the review. So this could be the research protocol again, formulating your research questions, so stating what questions you want to answer with this review in advance, comprehensively searching for relevant literature, so again, systematically picking keywords, picking databases to search in, going through studies to see if they meet your inclusion criteria so that you can decide to include them or exclude them. Extracting the data from those studies, and again, you want to do this systematically with a coding sheet, which is something we'll talk about. You will want to calculate inter-rater reliability. Even if you're doing a study by yourself, there's a way to do that by asking a friend for help. Because again, you want to be systematic about how you're pulling the data from the studies. Analyzing the data, this is the actual meta-analysis part. And then finally, systematic in how you're interpreting and reporting the results are also key points. So why are systematic reviews so necessary, so important? There may be so much literature on a topic that it's very difficult to use the traditional narrative techniques. Oftentimes in research we might see results that appear to be contradictory when in fact they are consistent. There have been several well-known papers published that say that people think that data lie or are misleading, but ultimately if you're able to go through in a systematic process, you're able to sort of find out the basic underlying storyline to a set of data and find out sometimes that there actually is more consistency than what you originally thought. It oftentimes is true that research produces results that actually are contradictory. So in some instances you may have results that appear to be contradictory, but turns out there's actually no contradiction, there's much more consistency. There may be other instances where you do find out that there are true moderating variables due to the different populations, treatments, settings, methods, designs, etc. that have been used, and you're able to come up with a better understanding of what's really going on by synthesizing the data. So a couple of examples of some of the earliest meta-analyses. We've got studies ranging from 345 studies all the way up to 866 studies. You can understand why the traditional narrative reviews have gone by the wayside. Very difficult to summarize 866 studies in a sort of a narrative fashion. So why else are systematic reviews better? Ultimately, they can be more objective and more replicable, which is obviously a goal of science. They're more efficient with the information, and they can deal with variation due to moderating variables. And this can be, again, true moderating variables that actually reflect true variation in the population, or what we'll call artifactual variance, which can include things, again, such as measurement error and range restriction, which are not considered to be true moderating variables in the population. All right, so just a brief summary here. Systematic reviews are a scientific approach. They have criteria that are determined a priori. Comprehensive, they rely upon comprehensive searches for relevant information, explicit methods of data extraction coding. Meta-analyses generally are used to combine data, and they are replicable. Versus narrative reviews, which are influenced oftentimes by authors' points of view, so it can potentially introduce bias. Authors don't necessarily justify criteria for inclusion. Search for data does not need to be comprehensive or systematic, does not need to be documented so that others can replicate it. The methods are often not specified. A narrative, summary, or vote count may be employed, and this ultimately makes the narrative reviews impossible to replicate.